In the ancient days, when Rome was still a city of wood and ambition, long before the marble of the Caesars, there lived a king named Tarquin the Proud, a man whose ego was as vast as the hills upon which his city sat. The air in those days felt heavy with the presence of the divine, as if the gods themselves were leaning over the edges of the clouds to watch the mortals scramble for power and prestige in the dust of the Tiber. One afternoon, while the sun hung like a heavy gold coin in a sky of bruised purple, a figure emerged from the shimmering heat of the Appian Way, moving toward the palace with a slow, rhythmic gait that commanded an eerie silence from the crowds. She was the Sibyl of Cumae, woman of such impossible age that she seemed more a part of the earth than of humanity. Her face a map of canyons and ridges carved by 1,000 years of sun and prophecy. Wrapped in robes the color of storm clouds, she carried 9 scrolls of such exquisite craftsmanship that they seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, vibrating through the very air of the marketplace. As she approached the throne of Tarquin, the heavy iron doors of the palace groaned on their hinges, sensing perhaps that a force older than the monarchy was seeking entry into the halls of men. Tarquin sat upon his throne, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest, his mind occupied by the logistics of siege engines and the taxation of conquered tribes, unaware that his greatest test had just arrived. The Sibyl stood before him, her back unbent, despite the weight of her years. Her eyes like 2 cold lanterns that saw not just the king, but the rise and fall of everything he held dear. "I bring you the books of destiny," she began, her voice a rasping melody that seemed to resonate within the king's own chest. "The 9 keys to the survival of Rome when the stars align against her." These were not mere histories or laws. They were the Sibylline books containing the secret names of gods, the rituals to avert catastrophe, and the warnings of every eclipse and plague yet to come. Tarquin, blinded by the glitter of his own crown, looked at the tattered woman and saw only a peddler of superstitions, a crone trying to trade old paper for the hard-earned gold of his treasury. "You speak of destiny as if it were a commodity to be bought and sold in the stalls of the Forum," Tarquin mocked, his voice echoing with a cold, metallic arrogance that made his advisors exchange nervous glances. The Sibyl did not flinch, but instead named a price so staggering, so utterly beyond reason, that it would have required the emptying of the royal vaults and the mortgaging of the city's future. The king's laughter was like the breaking of glass, sharp and dismissive, as he leaned back and gestured for his guards to escort the woman back to the shadows from whence she came. "You are a thief or a lunatic," he spat, "for no collection of words, no matter how divine, is worth the ransom of a kingdom. Take your scrolls and vanish before I find a cell for you." In the center of the hall stood a massive bronze brazier, filled with glowing coals that breathed a soft orange light into the corners of the room, a fire that never went out as long as the king was awake. Without a single word of argument, the Sibyl stepped toward the heat, her shadow stretching long and thin across the mosaic floor, like a dark finger pointing toward the inevitable. She took 3 of the 9 scrolls, the very heart of the collection, and cast them into the flames. The sound of the parchment burning was not a crackle, but a low, mourning moan that filled the chamber. A strange, intoxicating scent filled the palesa, mixture of jasmine, ancient dust, and something metallic, like the smell of rain on a hot sword. The wisdom of 3 lifetimes evaporated into smoke. The king watched, his breath catching in his throat, as the charred remains of the scrolls curled into blackened husks, their secrets lost to the wind that whistled through the high rafters. The Sibyl turned back to him, the orange light of the fire dancing in her pupils, making her look like a vengeful spirit summoned from the very depths of the underworld. "The price remains the same," she whispered, her voice now carrying a weight that felt like a physical pressure against Tarquin's heart. "For the 6 that remain are now more precious than the 9 that began." Tarquin felt a ripple of unease, a cold serpent of doubt coiling in his stomach. Yet his pride was a fortress he was not yet ready to surrender, even as the walls began to tremble. He looked at his advisors, men who had spent their lives studying the omens of birds and the entrails of beasts, and saw in their pale faces a terror that his own bravado could not mask. "Oh, she is mad," Tarquin muttered to himself. "Ass!" More to convince his own soul than to persuade the room, it is a performance. A trick of the light and the senses to make me part with my wealth. But the Sibyl did not wait for his internal debate to conclude. She reached once more for the remaining scrolls, her movements as fluid and certain as the setting of the sun. 3 more books were committed to the fire, and this time the flames turned a brilliant, haunting blue, casting a ghostly pallor over the faces of the silent courtiers. As the second set of scrolls dissolved, a sudden, unnatural wind swept through the hall, extinguishing the torches and leaving only the dying glow of the brazier to light the scene. In that darkness, Tarquin realized that he was witnessing the systematic destruction of his empire's soul, one scroll at a time, sacrificed on the altar of his own stubbornness. The loss felt like a physical blow to his head. He imagined he could hear the screams of future generations, people who would face horrors without the guidance that was currently turning to ash. Now, only 3 books remained, a mere third of the original wisdom held in the Sibyl's withered hands, as she stood perfectly still in the center of the darkened throne room. "The price remains the same," she repeated for the 3rd time, her voice now a thunderous vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. Tarquin stood up, his legs trembling beneath his royal robes. The realization hitting him like a tidal wave that he was no longer the master of this negotiation, but a victim of his own delay. He looked at the 3 books, and in his mind's eye he saw them not as scrolls, but as the last 3 lifelines thrown to a drowning man in a storm that would never end. "Stop your hand," the king cried out, the command breaking from his lips with a desperation that stripped away every ounce of his kingly dignity in front of his subjects. "I will pay," he said, his voice falling to a hoarse whisper that barely carried across the room. "I will pay whatever you ask, only let the fire take no more of our future." The Sibyl paused, her hand mere inches from the coals, and for a moment time itself seemed to freeze, the smoke hanging motionless in the air as the world held its breath. She stepped toward the throne, and as Tarquin handed over the massive weight of gold, he felt a strange sensation, as if he were paying for his own life, yet knowing he had already lost the better part of it. The Sibyl took the gold and handed him the final 3 volumes, her touch leaving a mark of cold soot on his palms that no amount of washing would ever fully remove. She disappeared into the night without a backward glance, leaving Tarquin standing alone with his 3 books, a king who had saved his city, but at a cost that would haunt his lineage forever. These 3 volumes became the most sacred objects in Rome, stored deep within the stone vaults of the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. They were the Libri Sibyllini, the final recourse of the Roman state. Handled only by the Quinta Cimbri Sacris Faciendis, 15 men sworn to secrecy and purity. Whenever the Republic faced a crisis that defied human logic, when the sky rained stones, or when the statues of the gods wept blood, the Senate would decree that the books be consulted. Yet, every time the priests unrolled the ancient parchment, a heavy silence would fall over the temple, for they all knew they were reading only the fragments of a much larger truth. They found instructions for the secular games, introduction of new deities like Apollo and Sibyl, and the rituals to cleanse the city of its sins. But they also found gaps, references to deeper mysteries and more powerful protections that had clearly been contained. In the 6 books that were now nothing but smoke in the Roman sky, the historians of later ages would reflect on this day as the birth of Roman pragmatism, realization that the most valuable things are often those we have already allowed to slip through our fingers. Tarquin's pride did not save him in the end. He was eventually driven from the city, the last of the kings, leaving behind a legacy of arrogance in the 3 books of the Sibyl. The story traveled through the centuries, through the rise of the Republic and the eventual crowning of the emperors, serving as a warning to every man who wore the purple. It whispered to them in the dead of night, "Wisdom is expensive, but ignorance is a debt that can never be fully repaid. Think of the scrolls as the opportunities of a lifetime. 9 appear in our youth, full of promise and the clarity of a path not yet taken. We scoff at them, thinking the price of discipline and sacrifice is too high, believing that we have an eternity of chances waiting for us in the wings. Then the fire of time consumes the first 3, and we find ourselves in midlife, looking at the 6 that remain with a slight twinge of regret, yet still unwilling to pay the price. We haggle with our fate, trying to find a shortcut, a cheaper way to reach the same destination, until 3 more are gone, and we are left with the final remnants of our potential. Only then, in the twilight of our years, Do we realize that the price for those final 3 is the same as it was for the 9? It still requires everything we have. Rome was a great empire, yes, but one wonders how much greater it might have been if Tarquin had possessed the humility to buy all 9. Perhaps the wars that lasted decades could have been settled in days. Perhaps the internal strife that tore the city apart could have been healed with a single ritual from the lost volumes. We will never know the contents of the lost 6, just as we will never know the versions of ourselves that we allowed to burn away while we were busy being proud. The Sibyl of Cumae was said to have lived for 1,000 years, a curse from Apollo who gave her eternal life, but forgot to give her eternal youth. She was a living metaphor for the books she carried fading, crumbling, and becoming more terrifyingly precious as her time ran out. She stood at the threshold of the Roman consciousness, a reminder that the divine does not negotiate. It merely presents the terms and waits for the mortal to fail. Even as the Roman Empire eventually collapsed under the weight of its own decadence, the legend of the Sibylline books remained as a testament to the moment they almost lost everything. The temple that housed them was burned, and the original scrolls were lost in 83 BC. But the Romans were so desperate for that wisdom that they sent envoys across the world to find copies. They knew that a Rome without the Sibyl's words was a Rome without a compass, drifting in a sea of history without a shore in sight. This story asks us to look at our own braziers, the places where we are currently letting our best ideas and our highest values burn because the cost of keeping them feels too high. We live in an age of infinite information, yet we seem to have less wisdom than the Romans had in their 3 remaining scrolls. We have burned the books of nature, thinking we could buy back the climate later for the same price. We have burned the books of community, thinking we could buy back our connection to one another after we have achieved our individual success. We are standing before the Sibyl right now, and she is holding the final 3 books of our civilization's future. Can you hear the crackle of the flames? Can you smell the scent of the wisdom we are losing in this very moment? The moral of the legend is not just about greed or gold. It is about the tragic nature of human timing. We are almost always too late to recognize the sacred, and we are almost always too proud to admit that we are standing in the presence of something greater than ourselves. Tarquin thought he was a king, but in the presence of the Sibyl, he was merely a child playing with fire. The Roman specificos of this legend, the specific names, the specific temple, the specific gold are all just costumes for a universal truth that applies to every soul. The Sibyl represents the uncompromising nature of reality. She does not care if you like the price, and she does not care if you think it is fair. She only cares that the transaction is completed before the fire finishes its work. Imagine the weight of those 3 scrolls in Tarquin's hands, the texture of the leather, the smell of the ink, the feeling of the divine pulse within the wood. He must have felt a profound sense of emptiness, even as he clutched the greatest prize of his reign. Every Roman who followed him walked in the shadow of that emptiness. A civilization built on a foundation of what if. The legend focus here is on that pivotal moment of the burn, the instant where the possible becomes the impossible. Once the scrolls are ash, no amount of gold in the world can unburn them. This is the finality of the Sibyl's lesson. Some doors, once closed, can never be forced open again. As we look back at the Roman Pacificos, we see a people obsessed with fate and the will of the gods. They understood that to be a Roman was to live in a contract with the unseen world, a contract that required constant vigilance and the willingness to pay the price. But even they, with all their discipline, were led by men who sometimes forgot the value of the divine until it was nearly gone. Let this Nazca serve as a mirror for your own life, a way to measure the scrolls you are currently carrying. Are you holding 9, 6, or are you down to your final 3? Don't wait for the Sibyl to turn back toward the fire before you make your decision. The gold you are hoarding, your time, your energy, your love, is only useful if it is traded for something that can survive the flames. Rome fell, the temple crumbled, and the gold was looted by invaders who didn't even know the name of Tarquin. But the story of the books remains, carved into the collective memory of humanity like a warning sign at the edge of a cliff. We are the architects of our own destiny, but only if we are willing to recognize the value of the materials we are working with. The Sibyl is still out there, walking the halls of our modern world, her robes dusty and her scrolls ready. She is in the eyes of the elders we ignore. She is in the silence of the nature we destroy. She is waiting for the next Tarquin to realize that the price of wisdom is exactly what it was at the beginning of time. And so, as the sun sets over the ruins of the Roman Forum, the smoke of those ancient scrolls still seems to linger in the air. It is a ghost of a reminder that we must choose wisely, for the fire is patient and the Sibyl does not give refunds. Take these words with you into the night and ask yourself, what is the price I am willing to pay for my soul? Thank you for joining us on this journey through the myths of the past. If this story touched your heart, please comment, like, share, and subscribe to Storycraft Studio for more legends that shape our world.